What is the first thing that comes to mind when discussing Justinian? Is it his glorious reconquest of Rome and the West from the barbarians? Or perhaps the building of Hagia Sophia, the greatest monument of Orthodox Christianity, still standing today? In our minds, an event like the Nika Riot is but a small page out of a series of victories that showcase Justinian's genius. But could it be possible that Justinian not only benefited immensely from this bloody tragedy, but also that he orchestrated it himself from the beginning? In this video, we shall explore how the emperor may have manipulated a series of events that led to the massacre of 30,000 civilians in one day, in order to achieve absolute power and realize his grandiose dreams. Justinian was born into poverty in the Western Balkans, but moved to Constantinople at a young age, accompanying his uncle Justian. Both men came from humble peasant backgrounds, yet Justian gradually rose through military service, eventually becoming commander of the excubatores, the palace guard, and later securing the imperial throne. Growing up in the capital, Justinian was given opportunities far beyond his origins. He received an education in history, theology, Latin, Greek, and law, cultivating a strong interest in imperial administration and the workings of government. By the age of 36, during Justian's reign, he was appointed Comes Domesticorum, commander of the imperial guard and palace troops. This position enabled him to win the support of soldiers within the capital and to exert growing influence over his uncle. As Justian's reign progressed, his advanced age and declining judgment left more and more responsibility in Justinian's hands. In this period, Justinian also served as Magister Militum Praesentialis, a senior general, and married Theodora, who would become both empress and one of his closest advisors. By the later years of Justian's 9-year rule, Justinian was effectively the de facto ruler of the empire, shaping policy and administration while his uncle's health waned. When Justian died in 527 AD, Justinian, then 45 years old, was crowned emperor. From the very start of his reign, he demonstrated his ambition and determination to strengthen and expand imperial power. He carefully chose capable and loyal advisors. Most famous among them was Belisarius, the brilliant general whose skill and fidelity would prove vital to Justinian's military successes and even personal security. On the administrative side, however, he chose two equally capable men: John the Cappadocian and Tribonian, both of whom would play a significant role during the Nika Riots. John the Cappadocian began his career as a notary for a Magister Militum, demonstrating administrative prowess. Subsequently, his work caught the eye of Justinian even before he became emperor. John thus became Justinian's chief legal advisor soon after, and during 532, he was already Praetorian Prefect of the East, a position which allowed him to regulate taxes all over the eastern provinces. John the Cappadocian thus redesigned the tax system in order to provide maximal revenue to the central government, probably an eve of Justinian's ambitious projects. This reorganization especially targeted the wealthy, including landowners and merchants, as well as the church, giving John a bad reputation with the public, and especially the elites, a fact that will be important for the events to follow. Tribonian was a man of equal importance to John the Cappadocian in Justinian's government, assisting significantly in the emperor's attempt to reform, expand and codify Roman laws, a task which has left its mark more than any other of Justinian's achievements. Tribonian studied law in Constantinople and became a scholar in the capital, a position which acquired him a close friendship with Justinian even during the reign of Justin. With Justinian's ascension, Tribonian became Quaestor Sacri Pallati, the person with the highest authority in the drafting of laws in the empire. It is thus made evident that Justinian in 527 already possessed many advantages that would indicate a very prosperous and successful rule: broad education, imperial legitimacy from his uncle, years of experience of court politics and administration, as well as capable and loyal advisors. All this begs the question: how could this capable administrative body allow for such a widespread riot to evolve under its doorstep and almost topple the regime? Could this all have been staged, and if so, why? In order to understand the Nika Riots, we need to first describe one of its key components, the Demes, and their dynamics with the emperor. So what are the Demes? Since the empire's earliest days, hippodromes and arenas were places where people would gather to enjoy chariot races and any form of public spectacle, with the chariot races being the most popular ones in late antiquity and the only surviving one during the Byzantine era. Charioteers would be part of teams, the 4 different Demes recorded in Byzantine history. The whites, the reds, the blues and the greens, with the last 2 being by far the most prominent, especially during Justinian's reign and especially in Constantinople, as the Demes were also present throughout the empire's largest cities, or at least the ones with hippodromes like Antioch or Alexandria. But the Demes were far from just charioteering teams, with influence all over the society, extending up to the politics of the era and functioning in a similar manner as sport teams with fanatical followings still do today. Thus, hooliganism would frequently take place, usually as violence between the opposing teams, and sometimes even against the local authorities and population. The 2 main Demes, though, also had their own beliefs both in societal and religious levels. The Greens were generally considered to be the Deme of the common people, while at the same time supporting of, or at least tolerant to monophysite beliefs, while the Blues would generally align with aristocracy and landowners and the orthodox doctrine of the Council of Chalcedon. It has to be noted, though, that this distinction is not that clear, since both Demes were mainly manned by lower-class citizens. The Demes also possessed well-defined structures, with elected leaders. At the same time, they performed public works and even helped with military affairs when needed. Not only the people, also the different emperors held allegiances with specific Demes. For example, Justian as well as Justinian favoured the Blues. But, and this is an important point to make, Justinian in 532 had already stopped supporting the Blues, holding a clearly neutral stance. This gives us our first indication of Justinian's machinations. Earlier emperors had consistently supported one of the Demes, not out of personal preference, but to redirect the violence of the opposing side toward their rivals rather than the throne itself. Justinian, fully aware of this dynamic, also knew how common Deme unrest was. The revolt in Thessalonica under Theodosius, uprisings in both Constantinople and Antioch under Anastasius, and further disturbances under Justin in Edessa, and again in the capital. Though each of these outbreaks was driven by broader social and economic tensions, none had ever threatened imperial authority as directly as the Nika Riots, nor come so close to overturning the regime. This relative stability had always been ensured by the imperial practice of backing one faction as a scapegoat, a tactic that Justinian, curiously, chose not to employ. On January 3rd, 532, a street fight near the Hippodrome in Constantinople spiraled into something far greater. 7 men from the rival Demes, the Blues and the Greens, were arrested for murder and sentenced to death. On the day of execution, the scaffold collapsed, sparing 2 of them, 1 blue and 1 green. To the onlookers, this seemed like a sign from God. The condemned men were rescued by monks and given sanctuary in a nearby church, where imperial soldiers dared not enter. Normally bitter enemies, the Blues and the Greens now joined together, demanding a pardon for the survivors. Their chance came on January 13th, during the chariot races at the Hippodrome. In front of tens of thousands, they appealed directly to Emperor Justinian. But instead of granting mercy, Justinian ignored their cries. The crowd erupted in fury, shouting, "Nika! Conquer!" And the greatest riot in Byzantine history began. As the crowds united, the emperor and his entourage retreated towards the palace, where they would be protected and could plan how they could deal with the crisis. The mob then rushed towards the city prefect Praetorium, where they would find Eudemon, the city prefect who could hopefully agree to their demands. However, he also chose to ignore them, and thus the mob set the building ablaze, and in the process also freed prisoners detained inside. Despite an angry mob already rampaging through the city, Justinian decided to resume the chariot games the next morning, January 14th. This decision is difficult to explain. If his goal had been to appease the populace, it would have been far cheaper to pardon the two men, whose lives had been spared by what seemed divine intervention. He could also have chosen a harsher route, direct violence, since the riot was still in its early stages. Instead, the emperor adopted a suspiciously neutral stance, appearing conciliatory while further enraging the crowd. As expected, the unsatisfied mob not only continued its violent outburst, but intensified it, setting fire to the Hippodrome, which was directly connected to the imperial palace. With the violence spiraling, the rioters raised new demands. The dismissal of three key officials, Eudemon, Tribonian, and John the Cappadocian. The choice of the latter two is revealing. John the Cappadocian had imposed taxes that favoured the empire's poorest, while Tribonian's legal reforms were also beneficial to the lower classes and to women. Their inclusion suggests the involvement of the aristocracy, who may have manipulated the crowd in an attempt to remove officials they despised. This time, Justinian yielded to the demands, though only symbolically, since both men were reinstated soon after. Nevertheless, the violence continued, forcing Justinian to finally resort to a show of power by unleashing Belisarius and his Gothic troops to contain the uprising. But matters escalated further. On January 15th, the mob sought a new imperial candidate, Probus, a nephew of the former emperor Anastasius. Although Rome lacked a dynastic system, blood ties to the throne provided a valuable claim to legitimacy. Unable to find Probus, the rioters pressed on. Over the next 2 days, the destruction intensified, with whole districts around the palace set ablaze. Despite the presence of the palace guard, Justinian and his court were effectively besieged, though reinforcements were on their way. On the 17th, Thracian troops arrived in the city. At this critical moment, Justinian made a suspicious decision. He dismissed Anastasius's other nephews, Hypatius and Pompeius, from the palace, a dangerous move, considering their brother had already been sought out by the mob as a potential emperor. On the morning of January 18th, Justinian appeared in the Hippodrome holding a gospel, offering to pardon the two condemned men. By then, however, it was too late for the crowd to relent. Still, the emperor had gained the moral high ground to justify what was about to follow. That same day, Hypatius was found by the rioters and proclaimed emperor, possibly according to Justinian's plan. Though initially reluctant, he soon succumbed to the allure of power as the crowd cheered his name. Now, in the ruins of Constantinople, a massive mob stood united under a legitimate usurper. At this point, Theodora is said to have persuaded the hesitant Justinian to remain steadfast, though the reality may have been more complex. In truth, Justinian had set a trap. On the evening of the same day, with Hypatius enthroned in the Hippodrome, the emperor prepared his counterstrike. Packed tightly into the arena, the rebels were vulnerable. Belisarius, now reinforced by the Thracian garrisons, stormed the Hippodrome with imperial troops. The massacre was swift and merciless. 30,000 rioters were killed in a single day. In a truly Machiavellian fashion, Justinian eliminated all his enemies at once. The violent gangs of the capital were destroyed, aristocratic conspirators were exposed, and potential usurpers neutralized. All while the emperor retained the moral justification of having offered conciliation first. Imagining an emperor willingly engulfing his capital into chaos, almost risking his life in purpose, in order to get rid of his internal enemies, may sound too far-fetched, also given that Justinian, at least in the early years of his reign, used his power to the benefit of the lower classes. As discussed, Justinian allowed for 5 key mistakes to happen, mistakes that do not match the profile of an experienced statesman like him, with 20 years of court politics and statesmanship experience. First, the fact that he chose to not side with any of the Demes, like the previous emperors did, to redirect violence. Secondly, the fact that Justinian did not give in to the demands of the mob from the beginning, even if it had no political or economic cost for him. Thirdly, the fact that he continued the games even after riots had broken out. Fourthly, the fact that he was reluctant to use violence early, even if he was capable and willing to do so. Finally, the dismissal of Hypatius and Pompeius, who were ideal fits for the mob to use as usurpers against him. But why would Justinian orchestrate this whole chaos? As already showcased, all of Justinian's internal enemies were exposed with this scheme. But there might also be other strategic reasons behind the orchestration of the riots. It was in the 520s and 530s that the population of the capital peaked at 500,000 people, never again reaching the same heights during Eastern Roman history. And this was no product of natural growth. It had been many of the empire's inhabitants who had sought for better opportunities in the developing capital. 2 of them were Justin and Justinian themselves. This demographic scourge could be a source of many problems, ranging from the inability to exert influence over the capital city itself, up to the spread of disease and squalor, as was actually the case with the plague of Justinian later in his reign. Furthermore, an even closer look at this population may provide insights. The immigrants in Constantinople may have been in large part men who may have not found the opportunities they had sought for in the overcrowded metropolis. Poverty, bad conditions, and even the lack of enough female population may have led to extensive resentment and eventually hooliganism through the participation in the Demes. All in all, the removal of this problematic part of the populace, combined with the destruction of his internal enemies, paved the path for Justinian to usher in a golden age for Eastern Rome. He rebuilt the capital based on his own vision, leaving his mark forever, after the city had been almost destroyed by the Nika Riots, and managed to bring back the glory of Rome in the West, in one of history's most epic sets of reconquests.